does it make any news? So let's turn to the audience now and sort of get them to sort of perhaps ask you some questions, either about the article or about some of the themes we're talking about, or even if you're open to this, some of your reporting during the Arab Spring, which was really stellar and outstanding. So the floor is open. I see Ravon at the microphone. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
I've been standing in line because
sorry, I didn't know. I didn't
I
know you
have
had
a question that I'm dying to.
This is a democracy.
Please.
I'm dying to ask.
Please.
It's about, first of all, thank you very much, David, for coming to our conference and for your presentation, wonderful presentation. Yes, I mean, these interference from foreign powers is not easy to get rid of or to stop. But if anything, we are a country of rule of law, and there is a law against supporting coups in other countries and supporting governments after coups in other countries. There is a law. And yet, you were in Egypt when the coup happened in 2013, and recently, a more recent coup happened in Tunisia. And the US really did not stop supporting these regimes after the coup. That's illegal. Why doesn't the legal system or our political system or together work to apply the rule of law, which is that we do not support a government after a military coup or after any coup against democracy? Why can't we at least hold on to that, law and, force the government, force everybody to respect the law? I mean, you were in Egypt, that's why I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, right. In my book, I wrote extensively about the decision within the Obama administration not to call the coup in Egypt a coup.
Exactly.
Manifestly, it was a coup. At a certain level, there are questions over my head. If you're asking why isn't the American government less cynical and more honest and transparent and ethical, that's definitely over my head. In point of fact, why did the Obama administration not call the coup a coup? It goes back to the things that we've been talking about. I mean, they were persuaded that their partnership with Egypt, and in particular their military partnership in Egypt, could be jeopardized if they called it a coup, and that was the paramount consideration. Their allies, as you mentioned, in the region were also strongly supporting support for the coup. The hacking of Ambassador Otaiba's emails revealed that he sent several pointed and threatening messages to his close friends in the National Security Council that day, warning the U.S. that if it didn't get on the bandwagon, it would face a kind of backlash in the region. That was his pitch. So that was going on as well. And the earlier panelists spoke in various ways about the fatalism or pathologizing of the Middle East, that these are, the Orientalism, the sense that it's always been like this, etc. That was also clearly at work. I think there was a certain fatalism or pessimism baked into many of the thinking by many of the top policymakers. Certainly, Secretary of State Kerry and Secretary of Defense Hagel, who were key interlocutors with Egypt at the time and key players in policymaking in the White House. I think they both thought, look, as Kerry more or less put it to me, Egypt has had these authoritarian military regimes for a long time. We've worked with them. Has it been perfect? No. Is it going to change? No. Which, again, that's a low expectation, and I think reflects some of the biases we've been talking about, and became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, arguably. But all those things will work. So we had the military partnership, influence of allies, and this sort of soft Orientalism or Islamophobia, I think.
Sarah Leon?
And thank you, David. I wanted to ask you about your experience and observations from your time at the New York Times, but within the broader American media, and certainly from my perspective, the New York Times being among the best in the world in terms of the coverage of what's happening in the world. Do you observe, or have you observed, as I tend to observe, and whether you think it's misplaced, particularly among national security correspondents, correspondents who cover Washington, cover politics in Washington, the reverse almost, or the flip side of the pathologizing of the Middle East and of Arabs and Muslims, a pedestaling of America and the American government as fundamentally agents for good, fundamentally well-intentioned, democracy-promoting agenda. And do you see that pervading their coverage and their description of decision-making in Washington, as well as accepting claims of the US government as fact? So for years, we've been subject to the Iranian-backed Houthis from the first days of the war in Yemen, without ever even needing to proffer any evidence for that, but never once describing the Saudi government as the US-backed Saudi government, for example. Do you see that orientation in the reporting, or am I reading too much into it?
Your question is quite sprawling. On the general belief that the U.S. has an exceptional and noble role to play in the world, I don't think that's embraced by the New York Times. I'd refer that question to Shadi in the back there. We can speak to that later. In terms of whether the mainstream media, including the New York Times, is too credulous of the claims of the American government, I strongly don't think that's the case. I mean, just the day-to-day incentives in the lives of American journalists is that if you can embarrass the American government, you get a gold star. If you can epically humiliate the American government, you win a Pulitzer Prize. All the incentives are towards skepticism, and that includes skepticism of designations of the antagonists in the Yemen conflict. I think you are factually mistaken if there was not skepticism in the New York Times applied to the Iranian relationship with the Houthis or the Saudi relationship with its preferred government in Yemen. I mean, I was involved in some of that coverage, and there was a lot of skepticism, as there should be.
Next question.
Thank you very much, David. And so, in the discussion, and if I remember correctly in your article, it's been a little while since I read it, the framing was really one of foreign policy, understandably so. But you've made a nod a couple of times to this notion of Islamophobia being a catalyst. I think it might be the other way around. I think it's really, that's the core issue, and it's really a domestic policy story, and with a foreign policy chaser. So the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding here in DC recently did some work on banking while Muslim here in the US. So I'll kind of use that as an example. Islamic Relief USA has had a lot of issues, maintaining accounts and maintaining financial relations, but even LaunchGood, which is the CEO of LaunchGood is a white convert, right? So it's just this notion of being kind of somewhat related to Muslim-y things that kind of gets you into trouble. And so if you'll just indulge me, I'll just give you an analogy. It seems that, like Muslim organizations are trying to kind of grow down the river, and they kind of have, like a hole. They have a leak, right? And they're trying to kind of get some water out of there. And it seems like these foreign, entities are just looking at that and maybe just kind of throwing a couple more cups of water in there. The core issue is that you have this leak. The core issue is that you have this kind of domestic policy that needs to be addressed. That's my perspective. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a catalyst. I just heard the panelists this morning bring up again and again in various terms, the Orientalism or the pathologizing of the region, and that squares with my opinion that that's going on, right? There is this weird thing that you encounter as an American journalist when you're talking about your reporting. People will, come back talking with people who I think of as sophisticated, educated liberals who would never knowingly indulge in anything that might be labeled bigotry, and they would say, what happened to the Arab Spring? Was the problem Islam? And I just think, what? Do you know what I mean? That's just such a false dichotomy. Like, one of these things is a religion and the other is a form of government. And by the way, you would be humiliated to say that about any other religion. Like, you substitute Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism in that sentence, and you would be laughed out of the room. And yet people say it with a straight face. So I don't know what causes this, and I'm not sure it's a policy problem, and I would love to know the solution, but it's definitely a thing.
Next question.
Thank you for your journalism. You made a comment about the motive that authoritarian Middle Eastern countries have in undermining, to do this kind of activity, in undermining their perceived enemies in the West. Isn't there also a role played by their attempt to undermine their actual or perceived rivals in their own lands? After all, it was a Muslim Brotherhood established party that won the election in Egypt.
I thought it went without saying that an authoritarian government does not like its domestic dissidents and is the enemy of free speech. I thought that's the table stakes for the conversation.
Okay, we're getting close to the end, so we have 3 people standing up. If I can just ask no one else to join the line so we can get to the questions and some answers. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's true, authoritarian regimes are trying to influence, and these examples that you mentioned are amazing actually for UAE and Qatar. But let me take this back here. In 1971, we had the Elsenberg, the Pentagon Papers, where we basically split the information about the Vietnam War in our own way. We had WikiLeaks. We have just lately the Pegasus files. Then we have the Twitter files, where we know that every agency here in this government is trying to influence and split the information right and left. And then, I mean, it is the idea that the authoritarian regime are doing it is not only them. Are we doing the same thing? Let me give you the last example. In 2003, 2 members of AIPAC were caught red-handed basically getting classified information from here, the United States, to Israel to influence our policy in Iran. And then what happened? The Department of Justice dropped all charges against these 2 people. And they were spying on us. So, is it the issue, is it really UAE, Qatar, or it's really the new colonial approach to meddling with other people? Thank you.
I find your question sort of going in a couple of directions.
I was going to ask you for a little bit more clarification on exactly what
Well,
your
I
question
can
is.
take it in 2 parts. You mentioned an Israeli example that seems to fall in the same basket as my examples, right? Foreign countries trying to influence U.S. policy. In that case, there was some some police action to try to deter it. Your other part of your question seemed to be about whether the U.S. government, in the Cold War era, there were lots of examples of the U.S. government trying to covertly influence other governments. Some of them became scandals here, and I think those are less often done now, because we do have still, knock on wood, a free press and a fairly open political process, so that when if the CIA were to try to set up a bogus newspaper and spin bogus ideas in some foreign country for the idea of influencing its politics, chances are that would come out eventually. And the fact, there's an internal deterrent to doing too much of that. It makes the US and other open governments less inclined to do that and less good at it, as much as they might try.
Go ahead.
This is a brief observation to maybe try to make a connection between the general point you're making and the Tunisian situation. I've heard from many people in the Gulf, in the Emirates, in Qatar and Saudi, that when Yusuf al-Qaradawi dies, which he now has, it's going to be a question of who is going to be the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood and the spiritual leader of the Muslim world. And what I hear very frequently there, it's going to be Ghanouchi. I don't particularly find that convincing, but I am reasonably convinced that a fair number of people think that's the case. So I wonder what you think of that, and does that help us to think about where Tunisia fits into this connection of what people what regimes in the Gulf are doing to influence the environment in which they live?
I think the arrest of Sheikh Ghannouchi is a tragedy because of the importance of his ideas far beyond Tunisia, and I wish more people would be paying attention to events in Tunisia. I don't particularly want to participate in a conversation about who is going to be the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Muslim world or political Islam. I just think that set of ideas is, that whole conversation is problematic. And again, we wouldn't have it about another religion. Like, the thing about religions is they're multiple and various, and their meaning is always contested, and that's the good news. So I don't think that Cairo Dawi was a very effective broadcaster and a smart theologian, I guess, for the people who care about those things, but I don't think he was unique in the world, and I don't think he's going to be replaced. I mean, it's just, the nature of any religion, including my own, is it's a constant debate about its own meaning, and that's going to continue.
The question is not, is that, I think that's a perfect example. The question is, do people in the Gulf will make policy, and they think that's the case, and that it is.
Well, I think if, the Gulf states really, they don't like elections, or they don't like democracy, and they don't like the idea that political Islam could be associated with elections. And for that reason, I can only imagine that Sheikh Ghannouchi was uniquely objectionable to many of the Gulf states.
Last question, Dan.
Yeah, this is by way of an observation. I haven't read David's piece, and I'm getting on a plane for Tunis tonight and plan to make that my
You've got a lot to
mission
look forward
number
to.
one.
Yeah.
It's going to certainly increase my sense of pessimism, I suppose, in many ways. But I'm in the throes of writing a piece provisionally entitled Rethinking Global Autocracy, which is sort of a deep dive into the literature here, coming particularly out of the think tank community, which attributes processes of authoritarianism and autocratization chiefly to Russia and China. It's good to be reminded of the multiple sort of vectors that are promoting autocracy globally, and that's part of the critique that I'm writing in response to the literature that's been put out by a lot of my colleagues. It's going to be interesting to see how this piece evolves. But I do want to say that we have just two words of kind of caution from my own sort of thinking about this, and it's been going on for months. I'm not finished, but I'm getting close to finish. And that is, number one, there's a complex relationship between the kinds of dynamics you're talking about, David, and the nature of any democracy, including the American democracy. And I get concerned when we hear words like subversion and so on, when I think that the key drivers of our democratic crisis are largely embedded in our own country. And these foreign effects exacerbate them. But there is a kind of notion out there that the so-called democratic malaise or backsliding is a consequence of international interventions and so on, particularly from the Russians and the Chinese. And we have to be really careful. It's a very complicated question analytically and conceptually and empirically. And the other observation is that there's an obsession in Washington with Chinese influence. That's all you hear about now. It's the #1 existential threat. We hear it in the Congress. And the consequences for our own Chinese American citizens has been quite negative. Because it's not on the par with concern perhaps with Russian influence in the 50s, but there's a lot of kind of McCarthyism out there about sort of Chinese influence. And I just want to say it's just very disturbing. And it's become an obsession here in Washington. And while there is a lot of malign influence, that's the term almost always used, malign. First of all, the question of how it affects our democracy is complicated, but second of all, it's certainly overdrawn, I think, in so many ways, and really detracts from a lot of the other sort of influences. We had 4 years of an American president who did more to model autocracy than any American president in many years. So I just sort of a cautionary tale about sort of where and what kind of causes we try to draw in terms of our own democracy. Thanks.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I tried to say before, our own democracy is, as I said, self-subverting, right? We have our own. Yeah. So I don't want to oversell the idea that foreign governments are I don't want to traffic in conspiracy theories. They're not. We can't attribute our own problems to others.
And I very much appreciate it.
Hidden hands.
Yeah, that's very important. Because now in DC we have this kind of obsession that is part of the policies of the think tank community.
Yeah, I just want to end by emphasizing a fact that everyone knows, that the quality of any democracy is really dependent on a free press, but also investigative journalists who are willing to take risks, to pursue stories that illuminate some of these sort of, scandals and, unethical practices that authoritarian regimes are pursuing, in this case in the Middle East. And if it wasn't for your sort of real, commitment to pursuing investigative journalism, we wouldn't know about this particular story, David. So thank you very much for the work that you've done in the past on the Arab Spring. Thank you for this recent article in the New Yorker. I think we are better as a country because of journalists of your caliber. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.